Steve Kolb is Director of Post-Adoption Services at Holt and is an adult adoptee from the Midwest. He received his Master's of Social Work in 2009 and is currently pursuing his PhD in Social Work and Social Research, focusing on adoptee community and empowerment models. Jolie Hanlon is the Camp Director of Holt Adoptee Camp. Jolie is a Chinese adoptee from the Midwest. She received her Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from Lawrence University. Caitlin Howe is the Adoptee Programs Coordinator at Holt. She is a Korean adoptee and works to develop and support programs for adoptees and their ever-changing needs. Caitlin earned a Bachelor of Arts in International Relations from Boston University and a master's degree in intercultural youth and family development from the University of Montana. Please join me in welcoming Steve, Jolie, and Caitlin as they discuss Knowing the Unknowable, Insight from Adoptees Working in Adoption.
Thank you, Rebecca. Caitlin, are you able to bring up our slides? Wonderful. Well, thank you to Concerned Persons for Adoption, the Adoption Agency Council of New Jersey, and Rutgers University School of Social Work. And thank you to everybody out there in Zoom land who's attending and participating in today's conference. We are so pleased and honored to be here, and we know that time is precious. It's not cheap. And so we really appreciate you giving us some of your time to talk about these critical topics. Let's start with some introductions, or more introductions. Again, I'm Steve. I've worked in post-adoption for a little over 16 years now. I'm adopted from Korea. I grew up on a farm, tiny little farm outside of a tiny little town in Iowa. Fun fact about me, I bought my first Nintendo with money that I earned selling asparagus by the pound. It was backbreaking work. I didn't really enjoy it, and I'm not sure what lessons I learned from it, but I did end up beating Mario pretty quickly after I earned the Nintendo.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Caitlin Howe, and I am a Korean adoptee. I grew up in California, but then my family relocated to Oregon because my parents always had a dream that we would grow up in the Pacific Northwest. So they made that dream a reality. And as a result, I feel like I have been raised to be a very typical Oregonian in that I like to hike, bike, eat, sleep, and repeat. That's sort of the mantra that I go at life with. And a fun fact about me that I'm constantly reminded is a fun fact when I disclose this information is that I went to college with AOC. We were in the same graduating class. That's Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Congresswoman. And during my time in college, I actually wrote for a blog that she started through the Center for Cultural Diversity and Inclusion. So that's my little sliver claim to fame and connection to a world way beyond me. And whenever I share that with someone, people always say, oh, you never told me. And so I feel like I'm trying to be more open with this fun fact about myself and being connected to the AOC world.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Jolie Hanlon. I am a Chinese adoptee. I also grew up in the Midwest, specifically Wisconsin. Prior to moving to Oregon, I actually lived in China and taught English at an elementary school for 2 years. A fun fact about me is that I have donated my hair 5 times to organizations that make wigs for children and adults. And I currently serve as the camp director of Holt Adoptee Camp. So now that Steve, Caitlin, and I have introduced ourselves, we want to know who all of you are. So in just a moment, Caitlin is going to pull up a poll on Zoom, and we would like you to choose the option that applies to you the best. So just take a moment and participate in this fun poll. right.
We're at 80% polled, 87,
Oh, we're at 90 now.
90.
Yeah, this is interesting. A lot of adoption professionals, a lot of adoptive parents, a couple of adoptees.
Right. I think 96% will call it here.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for participating in the poll. Looks like we have a diverse group here, a lot of adoption professionals, adoptive parents, as well as adoptees. So we are excited to spend the next hour and a half with all of you. I'm going to hand it over to Caitlin, who is going to be sharing how we're going to spend the next hour and a half with us.
Great. So I'll just take a moment to go over today's agenda for all of us that like a little bit of planning ahead. Hopefully this gives you a little idea of what's going to happen. So firstly, we'll go over talking more about the title of our presentation, Knowing the Unknowable, and talk more about what does unknowable mean. When we say unknowable as adoptees in this space, what are we talking about? So we're going to clarify the title a little bit. Then we're going to go into talking about a couple of our HOLT programs that really speak to how we know the unknowable. And in doing so, just give you a feel for how we have arrived to this place of being able to know the unknowable. Then we'll go into discussing the adoptee approach, which is an approach that we use in our work at HOLT and something that we're huge advocates for out in the world of adoption. Then we'll talk a bit more about adoptee empowered language and move on to adoptee empowered work, because we have found that those are things that are very similar, but also an evolution, one of the other. Then we will dive into something. It's a tool that we've created called the rubric. I refer to as the rubric, makes it sound really important if you put a "the" in front of the word. So the rubric, which is a tool that we developed for one of the trainings we did for our staff in regards to adoptee empowered work. And we'll apply this rubric and get you to sort of practice with it via a case study that we'll walk through together. We'll provide some time and space for a debrief. And then at the end is when we're hoping to address any of the questions that come up during this session or questions that you have in general for Steve, Jolie, or I. So speaking of questions, we have a couple of these slides that are just going to pop up through the presentation to remind you that you can ask us anything. And the way to do that is if you could directly message Jolie in Zoom through chat. If for whatever reason that is providing an issue, feel free to drop it in general chat. Will also see those questions, but we definitely wanted to give everyone space to ask questions anonymously or to their comfort. And again, we will be compiling those questions, and then Jolie will help us to answer as many of them as we can by the end of the presentation. So if you have specific questions, general questions about the content, what have you, please feel free to send those Jolie's way or just drop them in the chat. Thanks.
Okay, well, right off the bat, let me say that Caitlin, Jolie, and I are experts in the international intercountry adoption experience. We feel a lot of the issues that we're going to talk about today, they really translate and they overlap with the domestic adoption experience, especially domestic transracial adoption. But just know that our work and what we're talking about today is especially relevant to intercountry adoption. So the unknowable. Let's get right into it. Today, we are defining the unknowable as best practice in adoption work. And I know what you're probably thinking. You're thinking, well, we understand best practice. You know, we're all professionals. We have codes of ethics, accrediting standards, licensing, credentials, etc. All that is true. But we'd argue that best practice is still eluding us. And that's because best practice in adoption work is only apparent and present when adoptees are empowered to inform the work. So let's lay just a little bit of groundwork here. Adoption's been around since Moses. It's old. Right? Intercountry adoption, that's been around since World War II. It's old. There's been plenty of time for adoptees to say something. And so why haven't we heard them? Well, best practice in adoption work is unknowable because adoptees don't have much of a voice. There's a lot of reasons for this, but we're gonna focus on 3 big obstacles that prevent the development of adoptee voice. The first one's regional dispersion. So in intercountry adoption, if a prospective adoptive parent meets the requirements of the sending country, if they can afford the adoption fees, and if they can get through the home study process and are deemed suitable parents for a child, then they get to adopt, and it doesn't matter where they live. This has spread adoptees thinly around the world, creating a physical and an emotional isolation from each other. And it's just created, there just aren't enough critical masses of adoptees to develop a voice to be heard. The second big obstacle is the savior narrative. Domestic adoption in the early 20th century, it was pitched by social workers as saving children. Adopt a kid, save them, save this orphan, adopt them. They didn't beat around the bush with the whole savior thing. In the 1950s, Harry and Bertha Holt, who ended up pioneering intercountry adoption as we know it today, they were inspired by a film that they saw in church that depicted Korean war orphans as needing saved and rescued. And today's professional standards, this idea of saving children is pretty antiquated. We'll focus on permanency, finding families for children, family strengthening. But the savior narrative, it's still pretty pervasive in pop culture, and it's perpetuated in churches around the world. And that's because of biblical mandates to help orphans and widows. And let me be clear, helping children is good. Okay, Caitlin, Jolie, and I, we believe in helping vulnerable children. That's what we want. But framing that good work in the savior narrative is problematic because it creates an expectation of gratitude for the adoptees. When adoptees attempt to discuss some of the challenges that they've had with adoption or some of the critiques on the adoption industry, they are immediately met with, well, you know what? Sure, your life might have had some challenges, but you're lucky. Like, you're lucky, and you should be grateful for what you've got because it's better than what you would have had. And adoptees only need to hear this a couple of times before they realize, you know what, I can't talk about adoption because no one's really listening to me. And so they don't. The third large obstacle that prevents the development of adoptee voice is the birth culture primacy. And this one's specific to intercountry adoption. But this is really referring to like the go-to primary strategy that adoptive parents use and are taught to develop healthy identity for their child. It's just simply keeping their adoptee connected to their birth culture in whatever way they can. That's the foundation upon which a healthy identity can be created, or so it's thought. And I think there's some truth to that, assuming that it can be done. I'm not sure it can be done in a way that creates a solid foundation for identity, short of maybe moving to that country. I'm especially unsure how a couple of farmers in Iowa could be expected to foster that connection when they've never been to the country. The only Korean they know is me and my sisters, who are also adopted. But they're being told that this is how you address your child's identity development. And with birth culture, at a certain point, the adoptee's mind begins to shift from the statement, this is where I'm from, to the question, is this where I belong? And according to birth culture primacy, the answer is yes. That sends some mixed messages to adoptees. We're all trying to figure out where we fit in. That's a universal experience, but it's more complicated with adoptees. And when they're told in so many words, this is where you belong, it doesn't leave any space for exploration and discovery. And that lack of space to explore who they are, it prevents adoptees from finding their voice, simply because they lose interest in exploring that piece of their identity because what's being presented to them is confusing and unsatisfying. So, is it possible for adoptees to find their voice despite these major obstacles? How do we give them voice? Can we? Well, answering that question, I suppose, is why we are all here this morning. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's keep laying some groundwork. How do we know this if adoptees haven't been able to tell anyone? That leads us to Jolie.
All right, so one of the ways that we serve adoptees in post-adoption at Holt is through Holt Adoptee Camp. This is a summer camp for youth adoptees ages 9 to 17 years old. And every summer, the season runs from July to August. And we have camp locations across the country. So our camps are located in Oregon, Wisconsin, Nebraska, and New Jersey. There are two specific highlights about Holt Camp. The first is that all of our camp staff are adoptees themselves. So they serve as role models and mentors to the youth adoptees who attend camp. The other is that Holt Camp is like any other summer camp, but each day there's time set aside so that we as adoptees can talk about topics related to adoption. And these topics can range from identity to community to life transitions, as well as talking about birth search and birth families. And so it's really unique to watch campers in such a short amount of time share such personal stories about themselves. So to give all of you a kind of a taste of what camp is like, we have a short video that we want to share with you. So Caitlin, whenever you're ready. Remember the good old days when we were able to get together in person and not have to wear masks. And also a side note that no counselors were injured in the egg smashing activity. So speaking of when we were able to get together in person, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, we've had to transform our in-person camp program to a virtual camp program. So last summer we launched Holt Camp at Home, and this summer we'll be offering it again, once again, due to just trying to be safe and keep everybody healthy. And so Holt Camp at Home brought together adoptees from all over the US. And I want to share with you a photo from last summer. And so everyone that you see on the screen is an adoptee and of various ages. And it was really unique to be able to hop on a Zoom call every day for 4 weeks and see so many adoptees coming together and connecting and having fun and sharing experiences on a virtual platform. So speaking of which, I want to highlight a couple of the demographics of Holt Camp because we do serve a wide range of adoptees. So the first one is where our adoptees currently reside. So this map shows that all the states in yellow represents the state that an adoptee that we serve attends camp. So out of the 50 states, we served adoptees from 38 of those last summer. And so we really do serve adoptees coast to coast, and specifically in areas where adoptees may be the only one in their community, as well as they may be one of the few people of color in their communities back home. The other demographic highlight I want to share with you are the birth countries being represented at camp. So in the form of a word cloud, the size of the text correlates with the number of adoptees from that birth country. So you can see that China and Korea are two of the most common birth countries being represented, but we also serve adoptees from countries like Russia, India, Haiti, the Republic of Marshall Islands, as well as the domestic adoptees from the US. So the diversity of adoptees at camp is broad, and through our experience working with adoptees at camp, we are able to learn and hear from them about their experiences and apply that to our camp program so that we can better serve their needs and the adoptee community overall. So now that is a little bit about Holt Camp, and now I'm going to pass it to Caitlin, who is going to share with you about another program.
Great. Thanks, Jolie. So another program that we have that helps us to know the unknowable at Holt is our Circle Back program. And Circle Back is a program that really launched off of our camp program because surprise, surprise, it was important for youth adoptees to have support outside of a week-long summer program. So Circle Back is an adoptee mentorship program where we connect youth adoptees ages 9 to 18 to adult adoptee facilitators. We have 45-minute sessions with them. The adult adoptee facilitators are Jolie, Steve, and I, as we are the adult adoptees working in post-adoption. And this time is really set aside for intentional dialogue, connection, supporting, and just being a resource to youth who are really just hungry and looking for connections back to this piece of their identity. We offer this program in 1 or 3 sessions. So sometimes what we've seen is for adoptees that are struggling, they just want someone to talk to, and having someone to sit on the other side of a computer screen and say, hey, yeah, me too, or I've experienced that as well, can just be a powerful testament to the life experiences that they are having and the life experiences that many of adoptees, I would say most adoptees, have in common. And so this mentorship allows us for continued insight just into the current adoptee experience, and also just emphasizes the importance of role models and mentoring and someone offering guidance and perspective, but mostly just to be heard. This program serves adoptees all over the country, just like camp. It is a virtual program. It always has been. So adapting to COVID times was pretty easy, given that we were doing things mostly virtual. And we have thankfully been able to serve even adoptees that live outside of the US. We have a participant that lives in Belgium. And so we like to claim this as an international program. So Circle Back looks like this. It probably looks a lot like what we're experiencing now. We developed a curriculum that we walk through with adoptees that has conversation pieces. It has games. It is amazing to see how many youth still love Mad Libs. I don't know if you have kids or are familiar, but kids go crazy for Mad Libs today. So we have games like that. We have picture challenges. We have homework assignments where they just are supposed to have conversations with mom and dad or whoever's in the house. And it just provides sort of some intentional direction in regards to adoptee identity and in often cases racial identity, because those things go very hand in hand in a lot of our discussions. Can't talk about being adoptee without also talking about race, especially for transracial adoptees. So this is what a Circle Back session looks like. And again, it's just some more insight into what adoptees want to say and how much they want to say if they're given the opportunity, the platform, and really the support to do so. So with that, I'm going to pass it off back to Steve to talk more about the adoptee approach.
Well, the adoptee approach is as simple as it appears. And this is the philosophy and the approach that Holt Post-Adoption takes. It's programs and services for adoptees by adoptees. You think of traditional post-adoption services and you'll imagine that therapy, birth search, birth country tours, culture camps, file copies. These are classic. They're very important, to be sure, and they continue to serve a very important purpose. But they're improved. They can be improved with the addition of the adoptee voice. The adoptee approach allows us to create and build upon traditional post-adoption services by layering adoptee voice and sensitivities into the work. We're striving towards building community, and because of our youth programs and the work that we do with the youth, hundreds, thousands of them across the country from around the world, we're some of the few adoption professionals who truly understand the value of that community and the power that it yields. Their personal narratives when we're using the adoptee approach that more rapidly build trust and bridges and that accelerates community development. We firmly believe that everything in adoption is improved when using the adoptee approach.
Just a friendly reminder that we are taking questions throughout the presentation. So if you have a question, please direct message me in the chat. And then at the end of the presentation, Caitlin, Steve, and I will answer as many as we can. So
Great. All right, so now that we've laid some groundwork, we're going to move into talking about application. And for us, we have gathered all of this stuff that we know about adoptee communities. We know through our own experiences, but also through the experience of those that we serve. And so when we sat down and thought about how does this translate into adoption work and adoption training and just getting it out into the world, these things that we know, one of the ways that we found has been our first step is to really focus on adoptee empowered language. So probably don't have to convince anyone in this space, but words really matter. Language is very dynamic. It changes over time as we realize the words that we use can be triggering, they can be inclusive, they can empower. Language does a lot of things, and language especially has had a lot of power over the adoption community, but specifically adoptees. As Steve talked about the obstacles, all of those things can be addressed initially in the words that we say and how we talk about adoption, how we talk about adoptees. So in thinking about the adoptee approach and bringing the Unknowable out, we really started by focusing on the language and the words that we used. And we provided this training to the staff at Holt in terms of, what are some ways that we can just incorporate more adoptee empowered language. So taking a step back and really thinking, what do certain words communicate, but specifically, what do they communicate to adoptees, and how can we address them so that adoptees can be empowered by the words that we use as adoption professionals, as adoptees, and as just caretakers of our own community. So Jolie is going to walk us through some of those words that we've addressed and we hope to change to be more adoptee empowering.
thanks, Caitlin. Yeah, so we just have a few examples of common words that are used and heard in adoption. So the first word is gotcha. Raise your hands if you have ever heard of this slang term. Yes, great. Yeah, so all of us have heard it and we use it often in our everyday conversations. And I'm actually going to bring one of my co-presenters, and that's going to be Steve. And I'm going to ask Steve, when have you heard the term gotcha when talking about adoption?
Well, yeah, gotcha is often referred to adoption occasions when they're talking about the day that the adoptee joins the new adoptive family. So sometimes that day is the day that they arrived in the United States or moved into the home. Sometimes that day is the day that the parents would travel to the sending country to adopt their child, but it's always kind of couched around, gotcha, this is your gotcha day. And I had a friend, I have a really good friend who is an adoptive dad, and he was following an adoptee influencer on Twitter, and this influencer tweeted something about Gotcha Day and how, we've got to really start looking at alternatives because Gotcha Day just does not work. And my friend Eric, he immediately texted me. He said, "Oh my gosh, I've been celebrating, like we do Gotcha Day every year. Is this bad?" And I said, "Eric, no, man, no, it's absolutely worth celebrating, and it's absolutely worth changing the name. Gotcha is objectifying. It really has some kind of negative connotations, and it really feels like whomever is getting the object is like the owner and the gotcha." So, we propose a couple of different alternatives. You can use Adoption Day or Airplane Day or Family Day. Those are all alternatives that still express the same event and the same occasion, and it's more sensitive to the adoptee and it's more empowering to the adoptee.
Great. Thanks, Steve, for sharing your personal experience with Gotcha. All right, so our second example is the word cute. So once again, raise your hand if you have ever used the word cute when describing a person. Yeah, yep. How many of you, okay, I'm gonna ask you another question. How many of you have ever used the word cute to describe specifically a child? Raise your hand. It's okay, you can admit it. Yeah, so we're all guilty of using the word cute because it's easy and it's really accessible. It's just in our natural dictionary of words. So I'm gonna bring in my other co-presenter, Caitlin, and ask her why cute may be disempowering for an adoptee.
Great. Yes. Thank you, Julie, for bringing me in for this one. Yeah, I think when we see the word cute up here as a no-no, it could be like, wait a minute, are you telling me I can't call kids cute? But that is not the big message or the deep message to this. I think what we have realized in our work, and especially in working with different departments that work especially in family recruitment, and just seeing how children are referred to prior to adoption, we have just seen that oftentimes cute is attributed to children in regards to their adoptability factor. So if a child is superficially more cute, then whether it's directly said or not, there's sort of this feeling like, oh, the adoptability value is somehow higher. And that is something that is very much implied. No one would directly say that, only cute children are adopted. No one would say that. But it is disempowering to children who have yet to be adopted to have their superficialness be the thing that is most valued or most talked about or most referred to, especially in the case of children that are, vulnerable and they are totally disempowered and they don't have any agency in most cases. And so after a while, in most cases, if you hear the word over and over again, it's just kind of like thrown out there. It kind of loses value in and of itself if we're just saying, oh, this child is so cute and oh, so cute and so cute. It starts to just feel a little bit like, can't there be more that we can say about children that we're serving? And so when we notice this in the work that we do, the recommendation really is not to eradicate the word cute from your vocabulary at all, but to just really think about how we can talk about children, especially children that are yet to become adoptees or one day may be adoptees and that be part of their identity, in ways that are just more dignifying, find ways to describe personality, find ways to highlight certain facets of their identity, because in adoption now we know that most children that have an adoption plan are not infants any longer. They are toddlers and young children that have personalities and are expressing interests. And if we can have a higher standard for how we talk about them, it also means that we can require a higher standard of care and insight into who these children are from their birth countries themselves as well. So that is what we mean by thumbs downing the word cute and replacing it with just saying more words and making more effort to provide dignity, even from the very beginning that they come into the world of adoption and possibly becoming adoptees.
Thanks, Caitlin, for sharing your experience. All right, so for our final word is coming home. We often hear this when adoption is finalized and the child is coming home with their family, or if adoptive parents are returning from the sending country. And coming home, in a way, is implying that the home where the adoptee was in the first place is no longer going to be in existence once they're adopted. But we all know for a fact that their birthplace is always going to be there. And it's not disappearing because a child is being adopted. And so an alternative to coming home would be joining the family, because it acknowledges that where the adoptee is coming from is always there, and acknowledges and respects and honors that their original home is always going to be a part of their story and part of their adoption journey as an adoptee. And joining the family is more inclusive and empowering because it includes the adoptee's past and acknowledges this new chapter in an adoptee's life through adoption. So cute, gotcha, and coming home are just a few examples of words that are commonly heard and used when talking about adoption, and that there are alternatives that are more empowering to adoptees that we can use and that are more representative and up to date. So from that, I'm going to be passing it on to Steve.
Caitlin mentioned a little earlier that we provided a similar training or a similar presentation as this to our staff internally. And, when we presented this, some of these options for changing language and changing words that were more empowering and sensitive to the adoptee, they got it. They got it. They heard it. They internalized it. They understood what we were trying to do. And so since that training, gosh, I don't know, 15 years ago, I don't know, you lose track of time during COVID, whatever it was like a year ago, I guess. And since that training, I've heard in meetings regularly people being more careful with the words that they choose and correcting themselves when they use words that we just talked about here, gotcha, or kid's so cute, or I'll hear them consciously trying to change the way they speak. And it's lovely. It's super encouraging. It's heartwarming. It's motivating to me to continue the work. But it leaves me wondering where we go from here. How can we take the next step in using the adoptee approach? Words are pretty static. If we just give them a couple of examples of words that they can choose, that's a good first step. But there's got to be something more, something that's more dynamic, something they can apply to a broader scope of their life than just a handful of words. And that leads us to adoptee empowered work. I'm going to hand it to Caitlin.
Yes, so in thinking about moving from just the words we say to actually changing the work that is done, not just amongst Jolie, Steve, and I, or at Holt, but just in general from the adoption agency, we really wanted to move past the language and into informing programming through an adoptee lens. So really allowing adoptees and giving voice to adoptees to speak into existing programs, but also for adoptees to just be recognized in a different way within programs in all adoption aspects. And I think oftentimes it's easy to say, oh, or ask the question, are there spaces in adoption where we don't have to think about the adoptee lens? And that's sort of the question that I want to pose at the beginning of this exercise is, are there spaces in adoption where, adoptee lens shouldn't be considered? And then we'll revisit that question towards the end of the presentation. So in thinking about sharing this adoptee lens or getting more adoptee lens practice, adoptee to adoptee, adoptee for adoptees by adoptees out there, Julie and Steve and I wanted to create a tool, something that we could give to others and share with others that really emphasized how to think about the adoptee lens differently. So that is why we created the rubric, a working title. I'm sure maybe we'll come up with some inspiration of a way to refer to it in a less ominous way after this meeting. So feel free to give us feedback. But we created the rubric because, again, we wanted to provide more than just theory. We wanted to provide practice. And so that is the phase that we're going to move into now. So before we get to taking a look at the rubric, I just wanted to provide some statistics that I found, and these are from 2013. So I'm sure the numbers have changed, but stats like this really just capture the impact and the breadth of the adoption community. So there are about 1.5 million adopted children in the US, which is 2% of the population, 1 out of 50. Around 7 million Americans are adopted. That's domestic, international, familial adoption. Nearly 100 million Americans have adoption in their immediate family, where this includes adopting, placing, or being adopted. And so I put up these stats just to sort of capture and give us a snapshot of how many people adoption impacts. And I'm sure the numbers are higher since 2013. But it's not just a tiny niche group. It is a really large population of people that are impacted, have knowledge of adoption. And so if there are so many that are impacted, when we talk about applying the adoptee lens, we're talking about applying something that affects 100 million Americans, hopefully to the improvement and to the empowerment of the adoptees within that population. So here is a picture of the rubric that we created. I know it looks really tiny, and so you'll receive this. We want to make sure that we pass this along. It's definitely a working rubric, and don't get too nervous about reading it all here. We're going to go over it in more detail, but I just wanted to show you the whole entire thing as it is. So we have created this simple guide to evaluate through the adoptee lens and have separated it into 3 categories that we feel like are pretty pertinent to most pieces of content, most programs, pretty much. Hopefully it's very utilitarian. And those categories are representation, information, and participation. Then we went through and sort of graded them on being poor, beginning, emerging, or proficient in being adoptee empowered. And so this rubric is not meant to be an evaluation whether something is good or bad, whether something makes us feel inspired or makes us feel triggered. It's really meant to just ask, does this piece, this piece of content, this video, this article, this program, does it involve adoptees in an empowering way? And are they empowered through representation, information, and participation? And it very much can be the case that something can feel really great, but grade really low on the scale. And that is sort of the purpose, is to step back and ask the question, how are adoptees present? And that could really run counter to your reaction to the piece or how you feel the piece is. But that is what we are encouraging people to do when we're thinking about how do we apply the adoptee lens, or how can you apply the adoptee lens if you're not an adoptee yourself. So At this point, we are going to do a little case study. We've pulled a small news piece. I'm pretty sure this is a local Oklahoma news story. It's only a couple minutes, but we're gonna watch it together. It's called Single Mom Adopts Siblings Through Virtual Adoption. So we're gonna take a look at this, and then Jolie, Steve, and I will walk you through the case study, and you'll just get a feel for what we're hoping gets put into practice through this.
It's a landmark occasion, a judge in a courtroom signaling the official start of a new family through adoption. But over the last few months, the pandemic has forced the courtrooms to close.
We didn't get a chance to go to court with our friends and our families and them an opportunity to meet the judge or bang the gavel like most kids do. Instead, we did it by Zoom.
In their own home, on the computer, Cleveland County Judge Stephen Bonner finalized their adoption.
When somebody really loves you enough to adopt you, they have given their hearts to you.
Their story starts much earlier, when pediatrician Dr. Vicky met DJ in her own office.
My son was a patient of mine briefly with his former foster mom, and I had mentioned to her that I wanted to be a foster family and adopt.
With his adorable smile and calm demeanor, Vicky fell in love with the little boy.
When I went into her office, the first day she saw me, she wanted to be my mom.
The foster family kept in touch with Vicky and one day asked if she wanted to become DJ's forever mom. His little sister Brianna also needed a loving home, something Vicky's seen a lot in her line of work.
You know, you see kids that are neglected and abused, and you just know that there's a huge need.
Without hesitation, Vicky welcomed DJ and Brianna into her Norman home last October. It was actually a bittersweet moment for DJ, who's had to move too many times in his young life.
And I remember us sitting on the couch, and I put his head in my lap, and I told him this was the last time he was ever going to move. This is the last foster home he was going to ever have.
Every foster parent's house I went to, I would just stay for one night, then I would leave. It means a lot for me to stay here all the time.
Now 10 and 7 years old, Brianna and DJ have settled into their new home. While their adoption was anything but traditional, Vicky made sure that her son and daughter had the best day ever, marked with a surprise parade. And signs they'll keep forever to remember when they officially became one family unit.
Congratulations to you all.
Lacey Lett, Oklahoma's News 4.
Great. So thank you for watching that with us. And so it's really quick. These are pretty common pieces that you'll probably see just in general. They're not uncommon at all. And again, I just want to preface that our evaluation or analysis is not at all to discredit or disvalue anything that was in this video. We're just putting the rubric into practice. So I just wanted to give that disclaimer before we jump in. So we're going to evaluate this piece of content based on the three categories of representation, information, and participation through the adoptee lens, and whether or not it is a piece that empowers adoptees. So the first category of representation, I just wanted to throw up this quote. I saw this quote at the beginning of a documentary about Beyonce, and it really stuck with me. It's very simple, but whenever I think about representation, it just flashes in my head. And it's just that you can't be what you can't see. And part of our hope with adoptee empowerment is just to fulfill this, this line, you know, adoptees can't be what they can't see. So one of the reasons why we need adoptee empowered representation is because we just need to know what it means to be an adoptee and what it means to be an adoptees that, you know, disagree with each other, that, you know, go into different professions, you know, that have really great experiences and adoptees have bad experiences. We need that breadth of representation in order to develop and process and just be able to flourish in our adoptee identity. So we're going to take a look at representation. So here's the rubric scale. So a poor amount of representation in this video would mean there was no mention of adoptee in material. Beginning representation would mean that adoptee's story is being portrayed by someone close to the adoptee, but not firsthand. An emerging representation would mean that adoptees are able to share their stories, but may provide a one-sided perspective to fulfill an oversimplified positive narrative. This happens quite often. And then proficient would mean that adoptees have complete agency over what they share and how they want to share it. And they are given space to address all topics, even those that are stigmatized or taboo. So there's a little more information contained in there, but just for the sake of time, that's in brief where we put these different categories. So we're going to open it up to the room and launch another poll and ask you where you would grade this piece of content on the scale of representation. And I'd just like to say that this is not a trap. We are not trying to trap or expose anyone through participating in this grade. We just honestly want to hear your feedback, and then we want to share our feedback. So I'm going to launch this poll for us. Pretty simple, just where would you grade this in terms of representation? Great, great. 50% of votes in. All right. We'll go about 10 more seconds and then I'll go ahead and end the poll. So try to get your answer. I know it's kind of a quick eval, but that's okay. All right. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and end polling here and share the results with you. All right, so it looks like we have most in this room stating that this falls in the emerging category of adoptee representation. We have a couple who felt that it was poor, some that felt it was proficient, but most participants are falling in beginning and emerging category. All right, so now that you've shared with us where you've graded, we're going to share with you where we've graded it. And interestingly enough, I think we fall pretty similarly. So that's great. That actually puts me at ease to know we're all on the same page. It means that maybe it's working. So yes, from this content, we are given an opportunity to hear from DJ. He does get a little bit of airtime to share his perspective, something that was positive about what he was experiencing. We didn't hear it all from the little sister, or their stories were pretty much really packaged as part of the overall narrative was happening. So it was much more about the adoptive mom than it was about the adoptees themselves. So DJ was given a platform, but it wasn't exactly his own to share. It was just part of the overall narrative that he was contributing to. So in this respect, I think it's important to acknowledge that not all content pieces are meant to be adoptee empowered pieces. Like this was clearly a story that was meant to capture the adoptive mom's experience. But if we were to take a step back and ask, how could this piece have been more proficient in adoptee empowerment in terms of representation? I think DJ and his sister would have just been given a little more time to process. Maybe they would have been shown in terms of being amongst their peers, perhaps. Just to normalize that it wasn't, adoptees are often only seen in light of their adoptive parents instead of, we are among our peer groups and kind of hard to tell who we are sometimes. And so that is a way that this story could have been a little more proficient in representation. So we're going to move on to the next category, which is information. I'm passing it to Steve.
Thanks, Caitlin. So this particular portion of the rubric is designed to help guide or to assess when the kind of adoptee empowerment level when you are gathering information about adoption. So how adoptee empowered is your gathering of information about adoption. And when would this be necessary or relevant? I don't know, maybe when a local news reporter is doing a story on a single mother who's adopting 2 foster children, and they're running a piece about that story. So as like the last example, it runs a spectrum from poor, which would be little to no information about adoptees. The information provided supports a one-sided agenda, usually that's pro-adoption, benefits adoptive parents and the adoption industry. Moving to beginning, which is an awareness of current industry standard adoptee-empowered language, but it still relies on outdated information from a select group of adoptees, and it lacks a willingness to learn from adoptees of varying demographics and experiences. Moving to emerging, which is an active collection of real-life perspectives from adoptee experiences, plus a basic understanding of where to find adoptee stories and perspectives through articles and social media. And then a proficient way of gathering information about adoption would be regular discussions with adoptees and or an advisory committee to help inform practices, consulting with adoptee academics and researchers and leaders in regards to adoption work. So we would love to give you a chance to figure out, based on this case study, where the gathering of information falls on this rubric. Go. I kind of wish we would have had the Jeopardy music theme song to play during these times. I think it really would have added something to this portion of the piece. Next time.
Okay,
Thank you
5
for
more
participating, everybody.
seconds.
A few more seconds. I really, really like everybody's participation. We really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
All right, the results are in.
The results are in. It looks like everybody, for the most part, kind of went somewhere between poor, beginning, or emerging. Nobody felt it was proficient in its gathering of information about adoption. And that's, again, that's very affirming because as we were assessing this, we went ahead and felt we placed it right there. We thought that right where everybody kind of put it, nice. We think to be proficient, we'd like to see this reporter to interviewed, well, DJ and Brianna a little bit further, just like Caitlin mentioned before. We could have heard a little bit more from them, and the reporter could have interviewed an adoptee professional with the state system to get a little bit more information from an adoptee perspective about that particular process and system, or perhaps an adoptee who has lived experience as a foster youth who was adopted, and kind of get their thoughts on what the benefits and challenges of that experience is. It doesn't take a ton to be proficient. It just takes a little bit of work to try to find and to include more adoptee voice into its perspective. I will now hand it over to Jolie.
All right, so we've made it to the final category, which is participation. So the scale once again goes from poor to proficient. So for poor, in terms of participation, it means that no adoptee, the adoptee was not involved. Beginning would be like the adoptee was able to participate to some degree, as well as a survey or follow-up would have happened. Emerging, we're focusing on the adoptee being present and give feedback, as well as starting to get more agency in terms of how they want to be involved. And then our final level is proficient. So the adoptee has more roles in leadership, agency, as well as follow-up. So based on the case study that you just watched, where do you think this falls in terms of participation? So we have another poll. If you will choose the best option. Y'all are doing great. All right. We're getting good feedback. Ooh, it's looking like a tie between beginning and emerging. Just a few more seconds. All right. So it looks like it is pretty close between beginning and emerging, separated by 1 point. And then we have a few who said poor and proficient. So thank you for participating in the final poll. And so what we thought, we actually marked it as between poor and beginning, because we clearly saw that DJ was able to participate in the video. He was able to speak, but to make it proficient in terms of participation, it would have been great to hear from DJ's sister, Brianna, who was also being adopted. It would also have been great to know whether or not DJ wanted to share this story with the general public, as well as if we could have gotten a follow-up, because this video ends when the adoption was finalized. So if we could check in with them to see how they're adjusting, that would have helped this case study be more proficient. So with that being said, I am going to pass it to Caitlin, who is going to help us digest everything that we have talked about so far.
Great, thank you. Well, again, thank you for participating in that and just being present. I think when we walk through this and when we rehearse this, something that dawned on me is some may walk away thinking like, oh, you know, you're just being really hyper analytical. This was a 2-minute news segment on Oklahoma news. Like, how much do you want from people? Or at least that's how I feel like I could start to feel when given all of this analysis of just a short little snippet, probably aired on a weekday. And so I think one of the reasons why we wanted to do this was not to provide hyper analysis of something, but just to demonstrate what it would mean to apply adoptee empowered lens to even something like a 2-minute news story. Can we take that? It's really just meant to be a feel-good piece. No one really minds it. And really ask, okay, does this empower adoptees? And if not, how can we change it so that it does? And I think that that is the takeaway we want with the rubric, in just thinking about really stepping back from the things that we do and asking these questions about adoptee representation, information, and participation, and how evaluating them based on this rubric does provide more opportunities to say, oh, we don't have any adoptees participating in this adoption program. So if we don't have any adoptees participating, what can we do to get more adoptees to be part of it? Especially since there is just no part of adoption work that does not have an impact on our adoptee community. So in order to debrief this a little bit more, I wanted to offer a couple of questions that we are asking ourselves as adoption professionals and as those that are advocating for utilizing the adoptee lens and knowing the unknowable. So these are kind of questions that we might hear from you, but also we're hearing from ourselves in processing and continuing to develop this work. The first one is, where do we see the most need for knowing the unknowable in the adoption industry? Again, if there's no area of adoption work that doesn't impact adoptees, then where are the spots? Is there a spot where adoptee perspective could not be utilized or should not be utilized or would not benefit the community? The second question that we're asking ourselves is, how can we encourage all parts of the adoption community to know the unknowable and then apply it? Steve mentioned we can acknowledge the obstacles, but what can we do to overcome those obstacles so that knowing the unknowable doesn't become something that's rare, but something that is encouraged and embraced and intentional. And then finally, a similar question to the one posed at the beginning of this case study: is it possible to participate in adoptee empowered work without adoptees? So I think the question I asked at the beginning of the case study was a little bit different, but that really is essentially what we want to ask in this presentation and the question that we're processing. We can create these tools and really share our perspective, but what does it really mean to have adoptee empowered work if there are not adoptees present in the work? And if there are not adoptees present in that work, what can we do to change that? What can we do to empower them to participate and be a voice that is heard and a voice that informs and even a voice that leads in adoption conversations? So I just want to open it up to my other co-presenters first to see if you have anything you'd like to add. Otherwise, we would love to transition into a time of Q&A. So Julie or Steve, though, anything to add?
No, thank you. You've summed it up well, and I'm excited to hear from the audience if there's any questions or thoughts and feedback that they have. Jolie?
I also don't have anything to add. So Caitlin, you hit it right on the nail. So.
Great.
All right,
So I guess then questions. Do we have questions that we can answer?
Yes, yeah, we actually do. So we also have some comments as well, but I think we'll address the questions first and then we can circle back to the comments. And also if we do have time, we can also accept on in the moment questions as well if you just want to raise your hand. So the first question that we have is, so somebody has a son here who is adopted through the foster care system, but she can't help notice that Holt Camp is a multicultural camp. So can Caucasian kids attend and be welcomed at Holt Camp? Their son particularly suffers from trauma and attachment disorder. So wonder if there are other camps with children who fall in the same category. So I guess that is a question for me since I am the camp director. Yes, so we do serve adoptees who have been adopted through the foster care system. And, you know, every year we see more and more kids and the diversity at Holt Camp becoming more and more broad. So your son is absolutely welcome at Holt Camp. We try to create a really inclusive environment, and that any adoptee, regardless of birth country or placing agency, they are welcome at camp, and we do our best to serve each adoptee's needs to the best of our abilities. Caitlin or Steve, do you have anything to add to this particular question?
I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think that domestic adoptees are the third largest group of adoptees at Holt Camp. So Caucasian children, domestic adoptees, there's a presence. So if your son came, they would not be alone at all in the demographic with which they fall. So I would just like to share that.
I just saw a question pop up there in the comment asking about a little clarification on this specific camp. And yeah, it's Holt Camp. Holt International is the organization that the three of us work for. And Holt Camp has existed since 1983, and it's evolved significantly since its inception in '83. And it serves all adoptees. And as Caitlin and Jolie just mentioned, we have just a wide variety of demographics and kids from all over the country from different circumstances that brought them to adoption.
Great. All right, so this next question is going to be specifically for Caitlin. It's regarding the Circle Back program. So is the Circle Back program specifically for Holt adoptees, or is it open to any other adoptees?
Great question. Love it. And it provides an opportunity to clear up that we don't refuse anyone in terms of placing agency. In fact, another statistic about Holt Camp is that over half of the adoptees served at Holt Camp are non-Holt adoptees. So Circle Back itself also serves majority non-Holt agency adoptees. So more than welcome. There's none of our youth programs ever limit who accesses them by agency. So if you are adopted, you are welcome. Even if you're not, you're still welcome, but in a different way.
Thanks, Caitlin. All right, so this next question is for, I believe, Steve, but I think Caitlin and I can also jump in. But earlier, Steve had discussed about there was a thinning out of adoptees throughout the world so that there is no sense of community for adoptees, or something to this effect. Is this why Holt chooses not to place adopted children with American families who are residing abroad? And they're also not sure if we can answer that, but.
It's complicated when it comes to American families who are living abroad. So it's complicated for expats. It's kind of a case-by-case basis, depending on which country they're residing in. There are all kinds of factors. So it's a complicated kind of question. I would actually imagine I see Sama on the line here. She might be able to chime in and provide a little bit more robust context to this question. And I'd invite Sama to kind of briefly state how our expat program works.
Hi, I was actually going to I was just about to write in the comment section that I can discuss a little bit more about that if at the Adoption 101 training, that workshop that we're having tomorrow. But essentially, yes, it is a very complicated process. It doesn't mean it doesn't happen. We actually do have a couple of families, Korean expats, and then we're working with a few expats in China that are living overseas and adopting. So it does happen, but it's just a more involved process, and we do have to just kind of look at it on a case-by-case basis and what you're open to, and sometimes it takes a little longer, but we do work with some expats in some situations.
Woo! Thank you, Sama, for swooping in and rescuing us on that one. Appreciate it.
Awesome. All right, we got a couple more questions coming in through the chat. The first question is, where is the New Jersey Holt camp located? So we currently have a camp location in Princetown, I believe. Or no, excuse me, sorry, Pittstown, I think. We posted on our website, so it's been a couple of years since we've had in-person camp, but I believe it's Pittstown. Yeah. All right. So this next question is about Circle Back and Holt Camp again. So this person says that their children are adopted through the foster care system and have experienced trauma throughout their lives. Does Holt Camp and Circle Back provide programs that allow children and their special needs? Caitlin, do you want to answer?
Yes. So I think I'd like to answer the question in two ways. One is that Circle Back and Holt Camp are absolutely a place where we acknowledge trauma. We want to make sure to be clear that we're not a replacement for therapeutic practices or seeking professional services like that. But we do know that being a supplement to that and being adoptee, just connection is really powerful and can provide something that I think that general counseling and other things would not provide in certain respects to a certain extent. So we need to recognize our limitations in that, because we all share in the adoptee experience and professional qualifications, but we are also not certified counselors. So we want to make sure, I just want to make that clearly stated. It doesn't mean that we can't contribute something of high value, but we can't replace all services. I really wish we could, maybe one day. And the second part is in terms of special needs, Holt Camp has limitations in terms of what it can do, like just physically, because it's a traveling camp. We rely a lot on the facilities that we utilize during the summer, but we have found that we're able to be more inclusive with virtual programming. And so we've had a lot of campers that have been able to attend virtual camp that just couldn't physically attend Holt Adoptee Camp, whether it's cognitive or physical limitations. And the virtual space provides a very inclusive, egalitarian space for all adoptees to come, regardless of what level they can really participate in some respects. And so it's something that we continue to consider in our programming and how to be as inclusive as possible, while also recognizing the limitations that we have and really wanting to be a good steward of any of the adoptees that are put under our care or under Holt supervision. So it's always an open discussion. I think Jolie would say that we always want to make as many accommodations as we can. And we also just want to be a super good steward of our resources and acknowledge that we are limited, but we are always looking to be creative.
Yeah, and if you have specific questions regarding your adoptee, feel free to contact me or our camp registrar, and we are able to answer your questions and, see if we can serve your child's needs. And most of the time we can, so. All right, and it looks like Dana has included links to our camp page with information about locations and dates. All right. I believe those are all the questions that I received in the chat. Do we want to open it up if anyone has questions on the spot? Feel free to use the raise your hand function, and Caitlin, Steve, and I will try to scan the many pages. Do y'all see anybody raising your hand? Y'all were able to ask some very good questions. I don't see anyone. Caitlin or Steve? Oh, all right. We got a question from Rebecca. Rebecca, do you have a question?
Thank you,
Yeah.
Steve and Caitlin and Jolie. I loved your discussion about adoptee empowered language, because the language we use in every situation, whether it's with our adopted children, our family members, our coworkers, wherever we're talking about adoption, language is very important. Are there some additional ones? You highlighted 3, like the gotcha, the cute, the coming home. Because adoption has changed over the years, there's been a evolution of this language. Could you give us a few more examples of things that we should be thinking about?
Well, a big one, it's kind of an interesting story when it comes to our work at Holt. There's kind of a general tendency to infantilize the adoptee. So when we're talking about adoptees, we'll often interchange the word adoptee with child or children, and that's problematic. There was, I don't know, it's probably 10 years ago or so, when at work, you go into the Holt database, and in order to look up, so we would get calls and emails from adult adoptees requesting this service or that service, and whenever I looked them up in the database, I'd have to go under the child section of the database to find the information for a 35-year-old adoptee. And that was really, that bothered me a lot. And I'd heard in my time working in post-adoption from other adult adoptees that it also bothered them. Like, we're not children, we grow up, we leave the home, we have experiences just like everybody else does, but we're always referred to as children. So I brought this up to the IT administrators, and once they understood what we were saying, They understood like why that was problematic for adoptees to continually be called children. They changed it in the database, and so now you look up adoptees under adoptees rather than children. It caused kind of this cascade ripple effect of other issues for everybody else in the organization, but they were all willing to endure that and kind of work out the kinks with us, because they realized the value of language and the value of respecting the adoptee and the opinions that they were voicing. So despite the challenges that it caused for a lot of folk at Holt, they knew that in the long run, this was the best move to make and the best kind of language change to execute, because once it was presented to them, it made total sense. You know, they see adoptees and they really do see children, because most of the people at Holt working in adoption are placing children into adoptive family, placing children with adoptive families. And so, they think of us as children. That makes sense. But as soon as they heard the post-adoption perspective and the adoptee perspective, they were quick to make the change. So that's one example, Rebecca. I appreciate the question.
I can think of a few more that I'd like to share. One is, and this is, I think it's pretty much eradicated, but sometimes we see this in our conversations with kids, but just referring to adoptive parents as real parents. I think anytime the word real gets into the conversation, it's a little bit problematic, because we want to talk about birth parents as being real people. It's not a fantasy that they have birth parents. They are very real. So I think eradicating this idea that you have real parents and you have fake parents, I try to emphasize a lot with kiddos. The other thing is I really appreciate when it's referred to as a person is adopted instead of was adoptive, because was adoptive means it was a passive event that occurred long ago, and is adopted acknowledges the ongoing development and effort that it is to understand adoptee identity. And I think the last one, and this is the one that I think just personally maybe rubs me the wrong way, but anytime we talk about children as being available, it starts to feel very much like a commodification of children. And I know we say it really passively, and we have a waiting list and those children are available. But every time I hear it, it just hits like in a knot. It just doesn't give me great feelings about those kids that are very much, of what does available mean? It just doesn't feel right. I guess I don't have elegant words to explain why quite yet, but I do know that that is a word that has impacted me as an adoptee specifically.
Great context. Thank you. Thank you for sharing.
Mm-hmm.
We are very close to the edge of our time. So I think if there's one more question out there, we probably have time to address that.
All right, looks like Jennifer has her hand up and her audio is connecting. So while she is trying to connect her audio, I'm gonna mention something. So this summer, Holt Camp is gonna be virtual. So we don't have any physical camp locations. But to find more information about our virtual camp this summer, I just sent I just included the link to our camp website, so that if you have any questions about camp, you can find it there, as well as our contact information. All right, I believe Jennifer, looks like your audio is connected. Oh no, I can see her talking. Jennifer?
Oh, I'm sorry, Jennifer, we can't hear you.
Okay, I might be able to jump in because I think what Jennifer might want to ask, due to what she messaged me, is to know a little bit more about the topics that are covered in Circle Back. Jennifer, I hope that this is your question. Oh,
yes.
okay, great. Great. So yeah, the topics in Circle Back that we cover, so we developed this curriculum and it centers around two different themes. The first one being adoptee identity and the second one being racial identity. And so far we've really only served transracial adoptees. Should we serve one that is of the majority culture, you know, we would probably emphasize more of the adoptee identity piece. But we talk about language, we talk about birth family, we talk about birth search. We have really intentional discussion about adoptee things that aren't often talked about. We also talk about racial identity. So we cover just like sort of general vocabulary that should be covered for kids. Like we talk about race, we talk about stereotypes, we talk about discrimination. We cover those topics, but with an adoptee lens. Adoptees have a really unique experience with race, especially since we are one thing outside our home and then we go back in our house and we are the same thing, but somehow it translates differently. That's like a whole other keynote session, I'm sure. So we talk about those two things, but mostly it's just space to connect. So we never force adoptees to talk about things they don't want to talk about, because who wants to do that with a stranger? But really what happens is once you're in a space and you're with another adoptee, the organic way that it comes up is pretty amazing. It never ceases to amaze me how you can be talking about Minecraft at camp. We spend a lot of time talking about Minecraft and how discussions of Minecraft can turn into, oh yeah, last summer my family went to Thailand. Oh, I'm from Thailand too. Oh, you're an adoptee from Thailand. Oh yeah, me too. Oh, well, what's your Thai name? So, you know, just those sorts of things can just happen super organically. And that's what happens in Circle Back. The only difference is the facilitators know a lot less about Roblox and Minecraft than the kids do. And we can poke a little bit deeper in terms of the adoption topics that are covered. So thanks for your question, Jennifer.
I have a call.
All right.
Yeah, I think that is the end of our time. We so much appreciate having the opportunity to share with you a little bit about the adoptee voice and the unknowable that somehow we know through a lot of experience with adoptees. If you have any other questions or comments, this is our contact information, and it's also in the directory for the conference. We would love to hear from you. And again, thank you so much for your time, and thank you so much for everything that you do for adoption. I'll hand it back over to the facilitators at this point.
Okay, thank you so much for that, Steve, Jolie, and Caitlin. I'm magnifying what is being said in the chat right now. What an excellent, excellent presentation. It was both informative, it's filled with new data that, I mean, no matter where you fall in the adoption community spectrum, I think everybody learned something. I especially like the adoptee empowerment rubric. I really thought that was very informational. So thank you for sharing your knowledge and experience. And audience, remember, a recording of the keynote will be available on our website sometime next week. And so now we will have a brief intermission. The next sessions begin at 11.